So thank you for joining me, everyone, for tonight's One Night Stand presentation. This is a series of presentations that we do at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, where we focus on one work of art and one artist for one night. And tonight, I wanted to focus on the Plowers, which is one of the prints featured in our current exhibition, Powerful, the Art of Käthe Kollwitz, which is on view until January 4th. So we'll talk tonight briefly about Kollwitz's life, the print series that this piece comes from, and the print itself, of course. Before we get started, I did want to just note that Kollwitz often depicted themes including death, grief, sexual violence as well. And although we won't be spending a lot of time going into those themes in this presentation, I am going to be showing some work that relates to those topics. And so I wanted to just make you aware before we get started. So to begin, Käthe Kollwitz was born in the Prussian city of Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, Russia, but she was based in Berlin, Germany from the 1890s through the early 1940s. She trained briefly as a painter, but due to the influence of fellow artist Max Klinger, who advocated for the meticulous nature of drawing over the more free form of painting, she turned to printmaking as the medium for her social commentary, which also allowed her to have wider dissemination of her work. She had read Max Klinger's pamphlet Painting and Drawing, in which he elaborated his belief that the graphic arts were better suited to the expression of the darker aspects of life. And that was something that appealed to her, and she turned more toward drawing and painting after reading that pamphlet. She was married to a doctor, and her husband's patients would provide some inspiration for the artist, along with many other sources, including historical and contemporary conflicts, as well as literary works. She was a witness to both world wars. She lost a son in the First World War and a grandson in the Second, and so her own devastation is often reflected in the stark realities that she conveyed in her depictions of war and grief. She was navigating her career in an art world that was dominated by men and employing a naturalistic style in an era that gave birth to abstraction. And throughout this time, she asserted the value of her perspective. She would create etchings, woodcuts, lithographs, and toward the end of her life, bronze and stone sculptures as well. She experimented with mixing printmaking techniques and over time would simplify her compositions without sacrificing their legibility. Her subject matter and technique led to the growth of her popularity within her own time. And this also didn't escape the notice of those who took issue with her work. She was often quite political. So in 1933, the Nazi government forced Kollwitz to resign from her position as the first female professor appointed to the Prussian Academy. And shortly after, she was forbidden from exhibiting her art. Despite difficulties like these, she felt a great sense of responsibility to those that she represented. She wrote, quote, "I felt that I have no right to withdraw from the responsibility of being an advocate. It is my duty to voice the sufferings of men, the never-ending sufferings heaped mountain high. This is my task, but it is not an easy one to fulfill." End quote. Our exhibition that's up right now provides a sampling of her work, allowing the viewer to explore the power of these pieces. It also brings together works from our collection as well as two other area institutions, the Stanley Museum of Art and the University of Northern Iowa Art Gallery, as well as a private collection. So we'll turn now to the cycle of prints in which the Plowers appears. But before creating the Peasants War cycle, she had worked on the Weavers' Revolt. And here you're seeing one piece from the Weavers' Revolt series. So during this time as well, the size of her images and the scale of the subject matter was also growing along with her artistic ambitions and her desire to be even more kind of present in the message that she was conveying, more insistent in the messaging as well. Um, so in the Weaver's cycle, the sheets can be a little smaller, There's a little more kind of detailed anecdotal quality to them. And so she morphs into these larger works with the Peasants' War, not only in their dimensions, but also in the way that the subject matter is taking over the page, and also the presence that it has as well. And here is that Peasants' War cycle. So this was based on the Peasants' Revolt of 1522 to 25, which occurred in Germany during the Protestant Reformation. So the peasants during this time revolted against the feudal landowners who controlled the land and also their labor. And she had been inspired to explore this theme after reading Wilhelm Zimmermann's The General History of the Great Peasants' War, which was first published in 1841. And so his writing really appealed to her because like her family, like her father, Zimmermann moved in liberal circles in pre-revolutionary Germany. And so he sympathized with the demands of the peasants during the conflict. And he denounced the impoverishment of the rural population within his own lifetime as well. So, in social democratic circles, the Peasants' War was regarded as this kind of quintessential starting point of a revolutionary tradition and this kind of paradigm in fighting for freedom. So, for Kollwitz, she was looking at chronicling historical events from the perspective of the laborer. And these are stories that also echoed the working conditions of her own day. So she and her viewers would have also made the connection between the 16th century struggle of an agricultural society with that of their own time in which industrial workers were suffering. So, in an undated letter from around 1907, she gives a little more interesting information about the series. She wrote, quote, "Tell Herr Stulterfoth the following. The motifs of the plates of the Bauernkrieg are not taken from some literary source or other. After I had made the small plate with the woman flying above, I concerned myself with the same theme further and hoped to be able to portray it once and for all so that I was finished with it. Then I read Zimmermann's Bauernkrieg, and there he talks of Black Anna, a peasant woman who urged on the peasants. I then made the large sheet with the crowds of peasants breaking out. With this, I received the commission for the whole cycle. Everything followed on this already completed plate. 6 plates are ready." End quote. So here she's quite clear that she's not intending to specifically illustrate a literary source. She's not wanting to illustrate it directly. As an artist and as an advocate for the downtrodden, she's kind of identifying herself with this historic woman known as Black Anna, who was believed to have incited the peasants to riot. And except for that figure of Black Anna, who appears in Outbreak, which is the print that you're seeing here, the cycle wasn't meant to be based directly on these historical events or specific historical people, but rather on imagined stages in a revolution. So there's not supposed to be kind of a strict narrative or literary thread, but rather these kind of episodes within a cycle. So in 1904, she had approached the Association of Historical Art and applied for funding to complete the cycle. And for this, she was supported by the director of the Dresden print room and also Max Liebermann, who was her most important patron. And in 1908, the association published the cycle together with the art dealer Emil Richter. These were published and distributed to their membership. And as you kind of heard in that letter, it seems that she may have received the commission on the basis of that Outbreak print. And then after that, decided to unify the cycle by working exclusively in this sort of larger scale etching format. So she would end up rejecting 2 earlier lithographs and also ended up eliminating that smaller plate of Uprising, which she mentions in the letter, and proceeds on in the direction indicated by Outbreak. So the 7 images were made out of order and then were later arranged to create a rough narrative sequence. And the plate that we're focusing on is the Plowers. So this is sheet one of the cycle. And here she's really highlighting the peasants' oppression and their lack of rights that triggered the uprising. Here we have two peasants, possibly father and son, who are forced to yoke themselves to the plow as they have no oxen. Um, Sort of underneath and behind them there in the field in which they are, we have shapes that appear to be almost like crows kind of coming down to peck at the ground there. And we have a little bit of examples of earlier versions as she was figuring out this sort of final composition. And so there are some designs for the sheet that still exist from 1901 and 1902. These lithograph versions, the one that you're seeing there on the left, and then a drawing there on the right for a 1904 etched version. And it was only in the winter of 1906 to 1907 that she finally achieved her final expression of the work. So she was playing with these ideas and figuring these things out over a period of years as she was working on this. And throughout the course of both this print and also the series in general, the compositions become more simplified. Throughout these experiments, she kind of focuses in on what is important in the composition and ends up only using those things. So using simple lines to express what the overall story is about. She would also do an oil study for this piece as well, where she would include a figure of a helmeted soldier who would be dragging the men through their work and also symbolizing their oppression. In the couple of examples that I'm showing you here, you have this added motif of a peasant woman who is added in, and she appears kind of old and haggard before her time, silently observing on the right, holding the plow there on the left as they're pulling. But in the end, she ends up removing these extraneous figures, the woman, and in the case of the oil sketch, the helmeted soldier. And eventually, she just allows this kind of back-breaking posture of the plowers to speak for itself. You have this very shallow angle as they're pulling the plow in this sharp diagonal line, which hardly rises above that horizontal ground. They feel as if they've literally been sort of ground down to that level. There's a lack of strong verticals and upright lines that further emphasizes that low horizontality. There's a heavy sky up above, which further emphasizes that atmosphere of oppression and feels almost as if it's also kind of pushing down on them. And it falls right at the beginning. So she really is kind of setting up the series of events with this piece. She starts by focusing on these crimes committed against the peasantry, showing humans treated like animals plowing the land with the plowers, and then moving into the aftermath of a violent sexual assault with rape on the right. And again, with that piece too, highlighting this need for change and also a lack of rights and protections for the workers. Then she moves into the peasants preparing for revolts. So sharpening the scythe on the left and arming in a vault on the right, showing their growing determination of the peasants to resist. From there, she goes into outbreak, which we've seen already, but that charge into battle, that spurring kind of cry that raises up amongst them. But we don't actually see the actual conflict between the parties. Instead, we go straight to the aftermath here with battlefields. So showing their defeat here, the night scene, bodies being claimed by their loved ones. And originally she had thought about ending it here, but she ends up adding this last piece, the prisoners. So showing the taking of prisoners after the conflict. Again, still kind of this aftermath. Surviving peasants are captured and restrained. But here she does want to include a little indication that the fight is not over. So there's a figure toward the center of the grouping who seems to stare directly out at us with this kind of narrowed gaze, this almost kind of glare from the center of the composition. So there is still this indication that the conflict isn't settled, that there is still resistance among the group, and that rebellion could break out again at any time. Throughout the images, not once does she depict the perpetrators of the injustice. She concentrates instead on the suffering of the victims. She ends up rejecting any kind of allegorical figures, sort of like what we talked about in arriving at her final compositions, trying things out and eventually eliminating them for simpler compositions, and instead focused on what she was thinking of as the real events. She also made a point not to specify a specific time or place in the series and was aiming instead for something that could be read as being more universal, kind of a universal expression of these themes. She's also doing some interesting things technically here. She has quite a variety of transferred tonal textures in her prints. And these were all taken through a large number of the states in which texture is added on top of texture before the final completion. Um, and this is something that she would do in experimenting in how to create her final desired texture. So one of the things, one of the techniques that she would utilize um, is within the etching process. So normally in an etching process, you have your metal plate, and on that metal plate, you'll have a ground that will be applied. And the ground is kind of like a resist. You're able to then draw and make lines into the surface of that ground, which exposes the metal plate below. And then when that's placed into an acid bath, the acid will eat away at those exposed lines, helping you create your final finished image. Those lines can then be inked, run through the printing press to create your final print. So something that she would do instead of making her drawing directly onto the prepared copper plate, she would use a soft ground to transfer the drawing, a drawing that she had already made on laid paper. So this procedure most often consisted of laying a sheet of paper over the copper plate, which had been covered with soft ground. And soft ground, by the way, would be a type of ground that's a little more tacky. So it might have kind of a greasier texture. It's a little more tacky. Um, so she would lay the sheet of paper over the copper plate, which had been covered with a soft ground, and then drawing lines over it with a hard pencil. This action would remove the corresponding ground beneath those lines, allowing the plate to be bitten in those areas in the acid. So when printed, the lines produced would be a little softer and grainier than the usual etched ones. And I found this little illustration that I thought I would use to help illustrate that difference between the hard ground lines and the soft ground lines and give you a sense of the textures that she was able to create using this kind of method. Kollwitz would extend the potential of this procedure even farther by creating entire backgrounds of texture and often transferring these by means of the sensitive soft ground. The grain of the laid paper would actually kind of transfer over as well, creating some of that overall texture. So our precise understanding of Kollwitz's training in etching is a little bit cloudy and kind of contradictory, and we look to her own remarks as well as the evidence of her early work. But she's talked in a few different places about etching giving her a lot of difficulty at the start of her career. She was essentially self-taught, and she describes herself as not being very successful early on with this technique. Um, so she talks about how before she moved to Berlin with her husband in 1891, she had asked a copper engraver to show her how to ground a plate and what kind of acid one uses in this process, but there wasn't a lot of time for more instruction. And then in Berlin, she's working kind of just through her own study to come to the etching technique herself. So she receives some instruction, but also is having to figure it out herself, teaching herself. And she also notes later on that with her two children, she had even less time to be able to study this procedure. So we have these kind of anecdotes of early on, but despite knowing that, despite knowing her difficulties, her early attempts still have quite a bit of success and appear to be pretty successful technically early on. So whether that's kind of studies from the early 1890s to early figural studies to a first self-portrait in 1891, or this piece that comes just a couple years later, we can see her kind of increasing in her ambitions of what she wants to tackle in her prints, and also her grasp of the techniques is also increasing throughout those years. And so it seems kind of surprising that she would talk so much about the difficulty that she would have early on. It may have been that the difficulties that she was thinking about and referring to arose not so much with just the creation of lines in her etchings, but might have been more from arriving at the tones and textures that she was aiming for. These were really crucial, especially for her compositions for the Weaver's Revolt series. Um, and these were definitely somewhat experimental and could be troublesome for her. Often they would yield results that were not always quite what she expected or quite what she wanted. She would later write that, quote, I was very often discouraged that what was good as a drawing came off the plate in such a completely unsatisfying manner, end quote. But despite any difficulties that she had in developing her style and working in these different techniques that she used, by exploring these new surface textures, she was seeking to enhance the expressiveness of her images and to create her own kind of graphic vocabulary. And this would be quite successful for her in the Peasants War series. It was her most ambitious work technically up to that point, and it really cemented her reputation as one of the foremost German printmakers. Of course, there's always much more to talk about with Kollwitz and her career, um, even with this series and this particular print. But I hope that this has given you a bit more insight into the Plowers and the Peasants War series. And I do encourage you to come check out the exhibition while it is still on view at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I will stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Let me pull up our screen to make sure that you can unmute yourselves if you would like to. Okay, any questions for me?
Hey, Julia, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
In your research on this series, I know that they were issued as a set, generally speaking, from what I understand, you
Hmm.
said. And then they were sold to the members, I think you said. But do we know how many sets she made? Did you see anywhere in your research
Ooh.
whether there was a number? I mean, are there, is, how rare are they? Or, I mean, uh, can't imagine that there were too many, but she would have known how many to make because she would have known how many members were going to receive.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I don't think that's a number that I have in my notes. I'm trying to think back through if that was something that I saw as I was reading, and the number's not coming to my mind. So I'm not sure how many were created. I do know that later on there would be posthumous prints created as well. Um, and that was from a printer, Von der Beck. Um, and so there's some that occur in kind of the 60s. So there's some posthumous prints that were created too from these works. But yeah, I'll have to check and see what that number is.
Well, thank you. I don't know that we know. I don't know that the numbers out
Yeah.
asking sort of more in a hypothetical way because unless there were some sort of records for this organization and how many members they had, I'm not sure that we could track it down. Of course, a lot of them would have been lost during the war.
Hmm.
The wars, plural, because they would have had to survive at least two. So many of them wouldn't survive. I was just wondering, with a lot of printmaking techniques, you can't do thousands. a prince,
Sure. Yeah.
they
Hmm.
will wear out. And so, there's going to be a limited run anyway, but I wasn't sure if we had any idea what that run was, or, and I imagine she would have made them all probably at once to be distributed. And, but who knows, maybe she would issue individual ones later during her lifetime, even out of that set, if there was a request for one. Who knows? I'm not sure what
Yeah.
the price was then.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm curious too. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining me tonight. Don't forget to join us on Sunday for a Grant Wood in Focus from Sean. So check back in about that this weekend. And stay tuned for any of our other educational programmings coming up. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your night. Bye bye.